Welcome to another episode of Business with Passion. Each show features guests who have transformed their long-term passion into a successful business. I'm your host, Jay Hamilton Roth. My marketing strategy business grew from my love of talking with passionate business owners. In this series, I share their insights with you. Today's episode features guests who are focused on the kids. Scott Van Eschen graduated from Dartmouth College, where he majored in geology. He returned later for his MBA and then embarked on a worldwide investment banking odyssey where he specialized in mergers and acquisitions. He's now the president and CEO of Adventures Cross Country, the world leader in teenage travel.
Well, I think it all started most likely when I was a senior in high school and I was watching a television program and it was on an outward bound course where a bunch of kids went down to Chile to do some climbing. And I said, all right, that is what I want to do. So I saved money. I grew up in the Midwest, and so I was mowing lawns and I was shoveling driveways, and I saved my money. And then the summer before I went off to college, I went to Colorado, an outward bound course, and just got my butt kicked for 35 days running around the mountains, and I just loved it, every second of it. And I think that's where all this started, was really that moment on an outward bound course. I think I continued my passion when I went off to college. I went to a really outdoorsy school in New Hampshire. It was in the middle of the woods. And I went backpacking and climbing and did all kinds of things for 4 years in college. My first job out of college, I was hired as a geologist to work for an oil company. And it was a great job because they offered me a position in Denver, Colorado. The trade-off was that I had to go to Amarillo, Texas and train for 6 months. And I thought I could withstand Amarillo for 6 months. It was fine as long as I was going to get to go to Colorado and do all the great things in the mountains there. Unfortunately, after 6 months, they said, well, we've got good news and bad news. The good news is we'd love to have you here. The bad news is we're closing our office in Colorado, and we want to keep you here in Amarillo. Well, I survived another 2 years in Amarillo and then just had to get out. From Amarillo and working as a geologist, I decided to go back to college in New Hampshire and got my MBA. And I was again wondering what I was going to do. I thought maybe I'd stay in geology again, back to the woods sort of thing. And I got sucked into this vortex of investment banking and ended up getting a job, great job, the cream of the crop job out of business school, and got sucked into working as an investment banker in New York. And I ended up working in New York for 2 years. I worked in Tokyo for 3 years. I worked in San Francisco. It was an amazing time in that you got paid a lot of money. You really got to do amazing things. It was a great, great job on one hand. On the other hand, you just worked your butt off. It was probably once a week I'd be pulling all-nighters. I was never home, and it was not the kind of lifestyle that I grew up with. My dad went to every soccer game, every swimming meet I was ever in, and I ultimately wanted that for my kids. And you could kind of see the end of the road after a little while. My oldest daughter was born in 1992. And I would barely see her in those years working as a banker. And my wife and I had a lot of conversations about, was this the kind of lifestyle that we wanted to maintain with a family? And the answer was pretty readily no. We wanted to make a change. Well, I was at a cocktail party one night here in Mill Valley, California, and I was talking to a friend, and it was a woman named Lisa Halstead. And I knew she had this little tiny company called Adventures Cross Country. And I said, wow, what a great thing. That is so just amazing what you do with these kids. And she's kind of a smart aleck sort, and she said, hey, you want to buy it? And at first I wasn't sure if she was serious, but it turned out that she was. She was having her third child. The business was really, it was a one mom shop, really, and it was getting a little overwhelming for her. And so I vividly remember the car ride on the way home with my wife about, all right, what do you think? Should we buy into this little tiny outdoor adventure company for teenagers? You know, the real concern for me was, how was I going to transition from this kind of hardcore business job to this world, new world of outdoor education? And I have to say it was really very comfortable, because I understood how things work with rafting companies, and I understood how things work with backpacking. And so when I'm talking to the rafting companies that we're contracting, or I'm talking to families about a backpacking trip, it was just a very natural evolution. And so all those years of kind of pursuing these things as a hobby, which suddenly now became my profession, it was really a relatively easy transition that I did not anticipate. Let me give you a sense of how one of our programs work, and I'll use our Africa program as an example. All of our students meet in New York, and we meet at JFK, and we all fly together into Nairobi. We fly in Air Emirates, which we're pretty lucky. We get great deals, and it's a great airline, and so the kids are, feeling pretty good. They arrive in Nairobi, and it is absolutely a zoo. It's a totally, both literally and figuratively, I guess, and it is just a culture shock when they step off the plane. The trip itself goes from Kenya relatively quickly across the border to Tanzania, where we start our first service project. And last year, every year the service projects change a little bit, but just to give you a sense as to last year, one of the things we were going to do, we went into a Maasai village in the middle of nowhere, and our project was to build a soccer field. Soccer is a big deal there. And so working kind of side by side with all the Maasai kids and some of their families, we basically leveled a huge area, built goalposts, lined the field, got nets up, and it took us days to do this, as you might imagine, clearing it, leveling it. And then at the end of that project, they had a huge celebration where people from like 8 different villages came to see the soccer field. Again, this is like the social event of the year. Okay, the American kids, they've never seen American kids, and then they're working together, and now they built a soccer field, and we had a big giant soccer game between the Adventurous Cross Country kids and the Maasai kids. Apparently they kicked our butt, but ultimately they figured out how the score would be a tie because they're gracious hosts. And then afterward, the kids they dressed, the Maasai people dressed them all in Maasai garb. And then we went to basically a Maasai barbecue, which is a very unique experience, African experience. And the kids this was a day that they will never, ever, ever forget. And so, and we're going to do some soccer stuff again this year, but we're also going to be painting a school and doing some restructuring of some of their classrooms, and we're going to work in an orphanage there. So we've got some really cool service projects. Now, in between those, what we do on this particular program is we go on safari. And Africa is, when I first visited there, I had low expectations, and it just blew me away. It was amazing the amount of wildlife that you see. And in a day you'll see 20 and 30 lions, and you'll be driving along the road. This isn't even in the game park, but you're driving along the road, and all of a sudden there's a zebra standing there, and then there's a giraffe over there, and there are baboons, on that corner. It's just exactly what you would imagine Africa to be like. So they're doing this in between their service projects, and then at the end of this particular trip, we go to the island of Zanzibar. It's pretty intense being with these villagers, and you're on stage all the time. And finally, we get to Zanzibar, where everybody can relax on the beach, and we actually put everybody through a scuba diving section there. So they go to class, they dive, they get tan, they relax before they fly home. And so that's kind of a typical Adventures Cross Country program. It's hard to convey the amount of work that goes into putting one of these programs together. Anybody can put together a nice website, anybody can put together a nice catalog and say, you know what, we're going to take you to Tahiti or Costa Rica or Tanzania. But the real challenge in running one of these programs is, 1, doing a lot of work in advance, and 2, having all the resources in place if something were to go wrong. And when you're dealing with developing countries like we are, it's inevitable that things go wrong. Buses don't show up. Somebody gets a sick stomach. The outfitter just messes up somehow. So it's inevitable, and that's something that we deal with on a daily basis during the summer. The quality company is going to anticipate this, have backups in place, and really have the trip be as seamless as possible. I've heard of programs that things go off the rail and suddenly their kids are hanging out for a week in some town in Africa. I mean, that's inexcusable from my perspective. But trying to convey that to people when they're looking at your program is really difficult to do. We spend almost a year, in advance planning for these trips. Every day has, many, many, many details all figured out in advance. And then if something were to go wrong, where are the hospitals? Where are the backup buses? What do we do if the bus doesn't show up? All that sort of thing we've got in place just in case it happens. I think one of the things that an Adventures Cross Country program delivers is a unique experience. We want to be different from the normal tours that go to a country, say Costa Rica or Fiji or somewhere like that. As an example, we go to Fiji, and a lot of people go to Fiji, and they go to the beaches, and that's nice. And but what we do in Fiji is we'll go to these remote villages that really we become, every year, we've been going to these villages forever, and we are the social event of the year for these villages. They wait for us. When you go to the villages, it's the only way to get in there is to hike, typically, so we might be hiking for 2 or 3 hours. When you get there, it is like you've walked into a National Geographic magazine. They're living life exactly the same way they did 200 and 300 years ago. You have to sit down with the chief. You have to drink kava with him, which is a South Pacific drink. And depending on the whim of the chief, you might be there for 3 hours as he welcomes you. You might be there for 10 minutes. He's the king, so you do what he wants you to do. And while the whole rest of the village is waiting outside, as soon as you step outside, they're welcoming you. Every night there is a big celebration where our skinny little American boys are dancing with these 300-pound Fijian women, and it's just an amazing, remarkable experience. And it's that kind of experience on every one of our programs that we really try to deliver. The kind of thing that is really a once-in-a-lifetime experience that these kids are never, ever, ever going to be able to experience outside of one of these programs. So many kids these days want to do service, which I think is a terrific, terrific aspect to our society. It isn't just I want to go get tan on a sailboat. It's I want to go help people, and it's really interesting having seen that evolution over the years. And so we are working really hard to develop service programs in exotic locations. And so there's no question that that's going to be a big part of what we do in the future. Probably one of the things we'll do is we're going to focus on, say, topic-specific trips. Maybe it may be illiteracy in Africa, or it might be a reef study in Belize, or something like that. And I think that's probably one direction that we're certainly going to be going in the future. I was really fortunate in that my last career as a banker trained me pretty well to do a lot of the things that you need to do to run a small company. One of my jobs as a banker was looking at companies and analyzing them. And so I had the luxury of looking at hundreds and hundreds of different companies and seeing the ones that were run well, the ones that were run poorly, who did what right, who did what wrong. And so bringing that skill set into running a small business was, for me, invaluable. And so I think that's the first step, is you got to have an understanding of what's going to make it work. There are many, many, many companies, especially in our industry, that people have come in with a great deal of passion and no real business sense. And they've bought all kinds of inventory, and they get the best of this and the best of that, and have just splurged, and in a year they're out of money and they're out of business, and they failed. And our industry is just littered with companies who have done that. I think having that background was absolutely invaluable. But the other thing that I think is really important is when you come into a small business like this, you have to recognize that you are going to do everything. I'm typically the first one here in the morning. At certain times of the year, especially the summer, I'm often the last one out. And you know, you just have to do what has to be done. Our life changed dramatically. On the one hand, we had to move from the big old investment banker house on the top of the hill to the little house in the valley. No more first-class travel, no more great boondoggles all around the world. That was on one hand. On the other hand, I was at home for dinner every single night. I was seeing my daughter all the time. I've been to just about every soccer game she's ever played in, and it was absolutely a transition that I, haven't looked over my shoulder once in the 16 years since I've done that.
For me, the key strategic insights of Scott Van Eschen's success are, first, his love for the outdoors and family clashed with his high-pressure lifestyle. Secondly, he leveraged his business development skills to efficiently grow and manage a small company. And lastly, he's not just trying to safely take children on tours, but to also make meaningful, personal, cultural connections. Our next guest, Christopher Melville, grew up in Mendocino County, where as a child, he enjoyed role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons and Arduin. In 1994, he developed Fantasy Warplay, a live-action role-playing game where players of all ages can simulate swordplay and be an adventurer, a wizard, a warrior, and even a monster.
LARP is a game where you're acting out a fantasy adventure, and part of it is storytelling. It's kids telling their own story. It's something that all children have done. They've done it for generations. It's natural. Kids go out and they say, let's pretend that we're off on an adventure, we're going to be sword fighters, and they tell a story, and then people say, oh yes, I'm going to be doing this, and so it's something people have been doing for a long time. It's only recently that people have started to want to make it into some sort of game, to make it have rules around it. And so it was a long time tradition in Europe to do role-playing, is what it was called, where like Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, they would do this sort of role playing, and as professors, they would take on, like, they'd say, let's imagine that we were in ancient Greece. We would be characters. What would we do? How would we act? And then they would act out these roles, and it was a way of learning, a way of imagining being in that moment. And they started to create a few rules around it just so that it would stay very real. Well, other people started to market this. They wanted to get more into the money aspect of it. And so then they created games later that really marketed it all up. This natural thing that kids do, this fantasy play, they started to market it into things like classic RPG role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons and this sort of thing that you'd have, where that's where people started to go and make it into a marketing aspect. And LARP is something that they have similar roots, in that Dungeons and Dragons comes from the same history of role-playing and this deep history of fantasy, of children's fantasy, but they come at it from different aspects. I've written an article about the benefits of LARP and over traditional role-playing games. Often in traditional role-playing games, you have people rolling dice a lot, saying, I attack this, or I do this, and I do that, and usually those people don't have to do anything. They just roll the dice, and they do. And they do the most fantastic things without having to lift a finger. But they've never really experienced it. And there's a different type of learning. Christine M. Kress is a professor who studied the difference between learning that you learn cerebrally and learning that is epical, where it changes your whole perspective on the world. And LARP has the benefit of epical change. It changes the way that you experience the world. When you see a bunch of kids, or you're imagining that they're ogres, or that they're even skeletons or something rushing down a hill to attack you. You have this experience, you have a bodily experience of what's going on that transcends all this. And then when you're having to hold your own against them, physically holding your own against all these things, there's a certain sense of mastery that you don't get from rolling a dice. The game is basically freeze tag. So raise your hand if you played freeze tag before. Okay, yeah, pretty much everybody played freeze tag. Freeze tag is, basically tag somebody to frozen, and then you tag them to unfreeze them. But in this game, what makes the game really interesting is that it's freeze tag with swords and shields and bows and all that stuff, weapons, spells. I mean, it becomes very complicated. But if you remember that it's freeze tag, then pretty much you'll do really well for the most of the game. You'll play it the right way. Even though we have these swords and shields and stuff, we're not really trying to hit people like real combat and like really trying to fight hard. We're really just trying to simulate that, to do it like and in a more fun and adventurous way.
Well, I just think it's really fun. I mean, the sessions are really long, so you're doing it all day. It's an all-day thing. And I always like the whole fantasy idea and how you're always encountering new things. It's not always the same. So I kind of feel like it's a sport because it's kind of competitive, right?
I second that.
So, but as you go on, your character evolves and it becomes a lot of role-playing, but it's also just fun to play.
I second that too.
I grew up in Mendocino County, going to a private Montessori school that my parents were running. My parents moved up to Mendocino County from Southern California with this idea of starting a model school, a school that was a very different idea of what school was about. It was really a reaction to Prop 13 and schools just suddenly going from the top of the nation to the bottom. And my parents just said, well, we're going to educate our own kids because it's not worth it in the system. And so they first ran the school out of our house. And then eventually more and more people wanted to do it. It was originally homeschooling, but more and more people wanted to do it. My mom was a Montessori trained teacher, and so she used the Montessori base, but then added all these other kinds of educational philosophy that she'd been studying and created a school called the Melville Montessori School, which I went K through 12th grade in. And growing up in Mendocino County, you're out in the woods. Our school was right in the woods, backed up to a big green belt, where we had all this open wild area to play in. And so naturally these games sort of evolved. You'd be out in the woods and you'd be like, oh, let's pretend that we're sword fighters, let's pretend that there's dragons. And so we, of course, made up the games, and more we started to want to integrate the games that had the rules and the games that were just our imagination. So, you know, growing up in college, I did a lot of things. I mean, this wasn't the only thing I was doing, obviously. I was a dancer, I was a writer, but I really saw the connection between writing, the writing life of being a writer, and fantasy adventuring, because you are sort of writing a story. And that's my real passion with that, is that I want to write, I'm writing a story, and the kids are characters, they're telling their part of the story, and I'm telling my side. And so I'm evolving the story with them as characters in it. It was in 1994 that my brother and I were running a summer arts program. And the goal was to bring the arts to kids. All arts were being cut like crazy from education. And we really wanted to emphasize the arts. It was always something that was big in our Montessori school. Everyone was required to sing, everyone was required to do dance classes, everyone was required to do drama. Those weren't electives, you had to do them. And we saw this as a benefit too. So we wanted to bring this fantasy aspect into the game. Of gaming, we wanted to bring this fantasy aspect into the lives of kids. So we decided to start trying to bring this thing that we've been playing in the woods. We wanted to bring it into these kids' lives. And the school had moved up back into the woods. And so we thought, remember that game we used to play? Remember when we used to have those swords? That was so fun. We could do that. We could do that in our summer camp. And, you know, we're like, well, we'd have to make it safer. You know, like we just used wooden swords, and that would never really be safe enough. How could we make it safer? So we just started getting pipe and foam, and some of the parents too, we talked to them about it. What do you think about, how can we make this safe? And they started putting together pipe insulation, and it was sort of something evolving. But what if you did this? What if you did that? And the original weapons were really simple. I mean, they were a piece of bamboo with just foam around it just to keep it, you know, something really safe. Well, it struck a chord with the kids. I mean, the imagination of it. It was like for the kids, and in me too, it was like this dream that you'd always had of being able to really do this and be able to really, you know, fight and not have to feel like, oh, I better be really careful because I don't want to. Just have to be really gentle. You could really swing. You could really, and suddenly the kids were just incredibly animated. It was the thing everyone was talking about through the summer. When are we going to go do that game again? So we said, we got to keep doing this every summer, you know, for our summer camp. Summer camp would be really full, and it was always the thing people were coming to do. So we started implementing more and more rules as we needed them, year by year. Every summer I'd come back from college to teach summer arts, and we would do Fantasy Warplay. And each time we would add more and more onto the rules, adding a little more things here, trying to figure out ways, oh, how can we make spells? What would they be like? Oh, we could get these socks and we could throw them, and maybe we could color them and cut them and make them look like spells, or we could, what if we use this, and what if we use shields? So we just started inventing everything that we needed. And eventually it started to become so popular, we started doing it outside of the summer camp group. We started doing it just for our camping trips, at other school functions. People just wanted to play, and I just kept evolving the rules and evolving the rules. I started making rule books, and eventually it became so popular that I started doing it as an after-school program for teens. And but I'm also a public school teacher at a charter school, Montessori charter school, Tree of Life, in Ukiah, and so that's sort of my day job. On the weekends I go and I take that educational knowledge that I have and I transform it. It becomes something that I'm utilizing in LARP. So the stories that I tell in LARP, this world that I'm following, is still my curriculum. I mean, that's what I'm covering. We're covering things like critical thinking. When you're trying to decide who do you listen to, you have to analyze, are they trustworthy? What is their motive? Do they want me to believe something that's not true so that they can have gain from it? So I teach kids this critical thinking through real experiences where they have to actually go out and have a conversation with this person in a battle or right before a battle to discover if they can really trust the person that they're talking to. It also teaches, it's physical education. It's teaching them about, you know, how to utilize a sword, their body in space, being able to dodge, duck, move. It's not just educational for kids. It's not just something for kids. It is an adult league to Fantasy Warplay, and in adult league, it's not just adults. It's this blending of adults and kids working together and discovering that they can have a lot of fun in a game. And part of it is that adults really get into it for the story. They really understand that that storytelling, and just like reading a really good fantasy novel, which are also not just for kids, that there are these deep, deep issues that are usually happening in our culture today that are being explored in a fantasy or a story. So often you'll get into issues that can't really be described in a traditional way. You need a fantasy context to have somebody deal with an issue that there may be a moral or ethical issue that they're trying to deal with. So for adults, often the real benefit is the storyline, exploring the story and exploring some of these deeper moral and ethical issues that come up about, I'm doing good, but it comes at the cost of the deaths of all these people, and can I deal with that? Or I'm trying to be helpful in this mission, and I believe that what I'm doing is right, but I'm getting all the wrong information. And so I end up causing the destruction of all these other people, and can my character deal with that? The character development is really critical. Playing characters that are totally unlike yourself, I think, are really interesting. People really get into that. Playing some mischievous, really conniving little individual that you really get into and is totally antithetical to who you are can be really liberating, just like being in a play. A lot of adults, enjoying taking on a character, being in a play, getting to act as someone really, fun to be. Fantasy Warplay is growing. It's growing really in a big way. It's gone from me being in the park with my weapons to where, I have multiple trailers and, multiple sets of equipment, and having to take on actual staff members and friends to come and help me out run multiple events at the same time. The future of Fantasy Warplay is really more in expanding it out to wider groups, being able to do multiple events at the same time, where while I'm here running this event, I might be, another group of my friends is running an event somewhere else. Because at a certain point, I run 2 jobs right now, I can't do enough events. I have more business than I can handle. And so I'm expanding out now where on the same day, I can have 2 events running at the same time. And that's sort of the business model that's growing for me now. I think I see an amazing potential in the kids that I work with. It's incredible to me to see the caliber of the children that I encounter doing this, and the passion that they have. It takes a lot of passion to come to an event and to really play your passion and not be put off by people who say, oh, that's not so cool, or oh, what are you doing? That's silly, And you have to believe in what you're doing, and that's a good lesson in and of itself. But I also see incredible challenge for kids in that they have to take on amazing critical thinking skills, amazing challenges, overcome their fears, deal with really difficult situations, and they do it. They overcome it. And I'm really proud of them for doing that. I mean, the story that I'm telling right now, my Royalcon Game World, has been going on for 10 years, consistently, on and on. And in the game, that's over 500 years of time, because time passes differently there. And the people are still following this story, and still deeply rooted in it. And that's a testament to the kids that I work with, that they're that connected to it.
Sounds stupid?
It does. It sounds really, really stupid. Like my brother was talking about it, I'm like, okay. But then I tried it.
It sounds stupid. You go around and hit people with swords. It sounds really stupid, but it's really, really fun.
But there's a storyline. So
it's like this whole world.
Just try it.
It takes a lot of imagination.
For me, the key strategic insights of Christopher Melville's success are, first, his childhood passion for role-playing games and stretching what was possible. Secondly, he captured the spirit of play and childhood imagination. And lastly, inside the spirit of play, he's teaching children about humanity. Today's guest focus on children isn't just for selling things to them. It's to truly empower children for years to come. I hope that this episode has given you many good ideas for increasing your business with passion.